Studio 33 AD, Catholic Media.
There was once a farmer who wanted to impress his hunting buddies so badly. So he went out and bought the smartest, most expensive hunting dog he could find. He trained this dog to do things no other dog on earth could do, impossible feats that would surely amaze anyone. Then he invited his neighbors to go duck hunting with him. After a long, patient wait in the boat, a group of ducks finally flew over the hunters, and they were able to shoot down a few of them. Several ducks fell in the water. The farmer looked at the dog and said, "Go get them." The dog leapt out of the boat, walked on the water, and picked up the bird and returned to the boat. As soon as he dropped the duck in the boat, he trotted off across the water again, grabbed another duck, and brought it back to the boat. The owner kind of swelled up with pride as his dog walked across the water and retrieved each of the birds one by one. Kind of smugly, he looked at one of his buddies and asked, "Do you notice anything unusual about my dog?" One of them sat back and rubbed his chin and thought about it for a little bit, and finally said, "Yeah, come to think of it, that stupid dog doesn't know how to swim, does he?" As a kid, I grew up on a small farm in a small town in Oregon. There was an old pump house that was located in the deep brush behind Mom's garden. The rotted door to the shack was always kept closed. It was never left open, and rarely did anyone go down in there. I never asked my father about it. You see, I didn't need to. I had been warned by my older sisters, and they reminded me often about all the things about the ghosts that lived in that little shack, covered in moss and mold and cobwebs and tucked away in the brush. That's why the door was always closed. That's why no one went down there. Sometimes on a dare from my twin sister, I would go halfway down the steps, but I was always shaking and never stayed long. My older sisters would terrorize me with the scary stories about what went on in that shack. Many nights their stories came alive in my dreams, terrorizing me, and I would wake up crying out in fear, but just not too loud, for fear that their terror acts would multiply. I've outgrown those fears, but I haven't outgrown fear itself. I've been in the same boat as the disciples in today's gospel, beaten by the waves with the wind against me. Maybe you have too. My childhood ghost stories haven't ended. They've just changed. They've become adult ghost stories. I suspect that's probably true for all of us, right? We all have our fears. We all have our ghost stories. You know what I mean. I'll bet each one of you could tell a story about a fear in your life, about a ghost that haunts and frightens you. Maybe something that was said and can't be unsaid. Maybe a regret of saying nothing said. A grudge you so desperately are holding on to because you fear being hurt again. We fear our own death, the death of our loved ones. We fear the loss of health, security, success, possessions, addictions, and reputation. We fear failure and what others will think about us. We fear people finding out the dark little sins that we hold. After all, I'm the only one struggling. Everyone else is perfect. At least that's what Satan says. We fear being out of control and powerless. We fear the unknown, what will happen and what might not happen. We fear others, those who look, act, and believe differently than us. We fear Democrats, and we fear Republicans. We fear not being enough and fear being found out. And the list goes on and on and on. What would you put on the list? What do you fear? I've come to believe, my dear friends, that fear is a primary driver and controller of our lives. I've experienced it in my own life, and I've seen it in the lives of others. I've seen how it can take hold of us, distort our vision, and paralyze our lives. Fear determines the choices we make, the words we say, the words we don't say, the actions we take, and the actions we don't take, and the prayers we offer. Lord, not my will be done, but yours, as long as I get what I need. Fear holds back parents from speaking truth to their children. And let's be honest, the enemy is ruthless. Even in the tiniest of future disciples, he is ruthless. He knows that your child has the potential to grow into a world changer who serves a mighty God, and he will do everything in his power to derail the great calling of your child's life by speaking lies to them about who they are and who God is. A Christian parent allows God to use them to speak truth into their lives. It is your job to know the truth, identify the lies, and speak life into your kids. And here's what fear looks like to your children when we don't. Fear keeps our youth worried endlessly about their reputation and their popularity. What will others think of me? And their fear drives them to make poor decisions just to fit in and not to be seen as different. Don't let fear keep you from speaking truth to your children. It is a soul-saving mission. Now listen to St. Paul's fear today. We heard it in the second reading. St. Paul said, I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart, for I could wish that I myself were accursed and cut off for Christ for the sake of my brethren and kinsmen. St. Paul feared so much the loss of his brethren that he was willing to become accursed, anathema, for them, if only it would bring them to Christ. Do you have that kind of fear? That righteous fear for everyone you encounter? How about those closest to you? We should all have a fear of those who are not in the body of Christ. Unlike the Apostle Paul, who had no fear except righteous fear, fear determines what our church leaders preach. We are afraid to preach the truth. We water it down so much it's hardly recognizable. The truth's unsaid for fear of complaints or written letters, fear of loss, of losing mass attendance, or loss of social standing. It seems we fear many things, especially righteous fear and the loss of souls. Listen to the voices in your head and you'll hear fear. It's usually the loudest and most talkative, but study scriptures and you'll discover the most common thing whispered in your ear by God is be not afraid. In fact, 365 times in the Bible, he has said it, and yet most of us are. We've rowed the same boat as the disciples. We've been tossed about by the storms of life. We've seen the ghosts, and we've cried out in fear. Have you ever felt as if your world is drenched in darkness? Have the waves of life battered, tortured, and harassed you? Does it seem sometimes like you are rowing against the wind and making no headway? Have you ever found yourself alone, far from land and from safe harbor? If you know what that's like, then you know what it was like for the disciples in today's gospel. In those circumstances, it's easy to see ghosts, to be terrified, and to cry out in fear. That's what happened to the disciples today. It happens to us, and it's happening throughout our families, our nation, and our world. And make no mistake, my dear family, Satan takes great pride in this. More often than not, we cry out to be rescued from our situations which we are afraid of. We want to escape the storm. We want to be picked up and set down somewhere else, somewhere safe, calm, and comfortable. But here's the thing, Jesus doesn't do that. He didn't do it for the disciples today, and he doesn't do it for us. Instead, my dear family, Jesus reveals himself, speaks, and comes to his disciples and us in and from the very midst of the storm itself. He didn't take the disciples out of the storm. He entered into their storm. Jesus doesn't come to us from outside the storm in our fears like some divine search and rescue mission. Yet that's often where we look for him, outside the events of our lives. We are too easily persuaded that the solution to dire circumstances comes only from outside the circumstances themselves. Isn't that the exact opposite of what today's gospel tells us? Christ came walking on the water, through the wind, in the darkness. Jesus' words of comfort and presence are never outside the storm, but in the center, the very center of the storm. So why don't we look for him in that place of our fear? That's where Jesus shows up. Where else would he be, this man we call Emmanuel, God with us? If Jesus isn't in the storm and fears, then he is not Emmanuel. He is not God with us. I wonder if sometimes we miss what's really happening in today's gospel. It's all we see. If all we see is a gravity-defying, water-walking Jesus, then we have missed the miracle. The wind and the waters are about more than the weather conditions. They are more telling of what is happening within the disciples than what's happening around them. The real miracle of this story is that Jesus walks on the storms and develop within us. That means divine power and divine presence have and always will trample on, overcome, and conquer human fear. It means that Jesus, Emmanuel, Jesus truly is God with us. He's with us in the direst of our circumstances, but the disciples couldn't recognize him. And let's be honest, sometimes we don't either. "It's a ghost," they screamed in terror. That's the only thing that made sense. People don't walk on water. It had to be a ghost. What else could it be? You see, that's the power of fear, to deceive and to drown. It makes no sense to think that the very elements that threaten our lives are the same elements from which new life comes. But isn't that precisely the way of the cross? Isn't that the story of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection? Isn't that the good news we so desperately need to hear, that God is with us? Isn't that what happened in today's gospel? Our storms and fears are the place where God wants us to abandon ourselves. Most of us, however, don't do it until we feel abandoned ourselves. Is that the way the disciples must have felt? Jesus made them get into a boat and cross the sea, apparently alone. They had been abandoned to the open sea, the darkness, the waves, and the winds, the failure of their own efforts and their illusions. They were abandoned to their own unself-sufficiency so that they might abandon themselves to God. The very elements that they recognized Jesus, the very elements that threatened to tear down the disciples, became the environment in which they recognized Jesus truly as the Son of God. What they first glimpsed as certain death, they now recognize as new life, hope, and salvation. Every time we cry out in fear, Jesus comes saying, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." That's the invitation, my friends, to abandon ourselves to God in the midst of our storms and our fears. So no matter how high, my dear friends, especially my young brothers and sisters here today who will be entering school shortly in middle school and high school and college, no matter how high the waves rise, they are the waves on which Emmanuel walks to us. No matter how strong the wind that blows, it is the wind through which our Emmanuel walks to us. No matter how dark the night is, it is the night in which our Emmanuel comes to us. No matter how great our fear, it is our fear that Jesus Christ has already trampled and defeated. Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid.
Studio 33 AD, Catholic Media.